just got a notice that there's going to be a new tax to raise funds for the upkeep of my city's new hiking trail. I don't really mind though. I spoke to my city council member and attended some of the meetings, so I feel like my voice was heard on the issue. In our American democracy, we continue to work on creating a system of government in which everyone can be heard. That wasn't always the case. Before the start of the American Revolution, many colonists felt that their voices weren't being heard by the British government. Let's take a look back at the beginning of our country to see how the ideas that shape our democracy got their start. The French and Indian War. The colonists really started to feel discontented after the French and Indian War. This was a war between American colonists, with British soldiers for support, and the French. Both wanted to control the area near the Ohio River Valley. The war got its name because Britain and its American colonies were on one side of the conflict, while France and its Indian or Native American allies were on the other. The French and Indian War was also called the 7 Years' War. Officially, the war began in 1756, although the two sides had been fighting for 2 years before then. Fighting continued until 1763, when the British were able to drive the French out of the region, and the Treaty of Paris was signed. The war was expensive for Britain and left the king with a large national debt. The king and Parliament felt that the Americans should help pay for the war effort. Let's review what we have just learned about the French and Indian War. Question 1. What is the nickname for the French and Indian War? A. Native American War. B. British and French War. C. 7 Years' War. D. Colonial War. If you answered C, you know that the French and Indian War is also called the 7 Years' War. Question 2. In what year did the French and Indian War officially begin? A. 1756. B. 1776. C. 1860. D. 1899. The correct answer is A. The French and Indian War officially began in 1756. Question 3. The French and Indian War was a conflict over what geographical area? A. New England. B. Maryland. C. Ohio River Valley. D. Florida. The correct answer is C. The war was a conflict over the Ohio River Valley. The Stamp Act. The British government needed to raise money to pay for the French and Indian War. That's why, in 1765, Parliament considered a bill called the Stamp Act. The idea behind the bill was that the American colonies should pay for the protection that the British had and continue to provide. The bill also called for a new measure of protection for the colonies. 10,000 British troops were called to be stationed along the frontier, near the Appalachian Mountains. The Stamp Act was approved by Parliament on February 17, 1765. It put a tax on almost every printed piece of paper that was used in the American colonies, including newspapers, legal documents, and licenses. They even taxed playing cards. Prior to the Stamp Act, the British government had given the colonies a great deal of freedom to govern themselves. The colonists saw the Stamp Act as Britain's way of using the colonies as a source of revenue or income, without first getting approval from the colonial legislatures. They thought the British government was becoming too powerful over the colonies. The colonists pointed to the fact that the Stamp Act was one of several new laws and taxes that the British government created after the French and Indian War. They were against these taxes because the colonies had no representatives in the British Parliament, so their voices were not being heard on these matters. No taxation without representation became the cry of the colonists. People opposed to the new laws began to organize protests against the British government. One group of protesters, the Sons of Liberty, formed in 1765 in Boston, Massachusetts. Colonial legislatures officially objected to the Stamp Act too. Colonial citizens boycotted British businesses, and the number of protest groups began to grow. Eventually, it became too difficult for Britain to enforce the Stamp Act, so Parliament revoked the act in March of 1766. Let's review what we have learned about the Stamp Act. Question 1. As a result of the Stamp Act, how many British troops were stationed near the Appalachian Mountains? A. 1,000. B. 5,000. C. 10,000. Or D. 60,000. The correct answer is C. 10,000 British troops were stationed near the Appalachian Mountains. Question 2. The Stamp Act was a tax on what? A. Printed paper and documents. B. Tea. C. Sugar. D. Postal delivery services. If you answered A, you know that the Stamp Act taxed printed paper and documents. Question 3. What was the slogan of the colonists who were opposed to the Stamp Act? A. Boycott the papers. B. Citizens against unfair taxes. C. Colonies unite. D. No taxation without representation. The correct answer is D. Their slogan was no taxation without representation. The Boston Tea Party. Although the Stamp Act had been repealed, the bad feelings between the British and the American colonists continued to grow. The British wanted the Americans to pay more for the protection of the colonies and for royal rule, while the Americans were resistant to British taxes and rules and the limits that were being placed on their ability to rule themselves. The Townshend Act of 1767 was another parliamentary act that contributed to the growing tension between Britain and the colonies. This act allowed Parliament to issue taxes on imports like glass, lead, paint, and tea. Again, colonists responded with boycotts and protests. Tensions grew again in 1773 when Parliament passed the Tea Act. This allowed the British East India Tea Company to become the only tea company to sell tea in the American colonies. The colonists were furious at the idea of Parliament interfering with colonial business. Protests over the Tea Act spread throughout the colonies. In some cities, the tea ships from England were allowed to be unloaded, but the tea was left on the docks to rot. Ships carrying tea into ports in Pennsylvania and New York were not allowed to unload their cargo and were sent back to England. From late November to mid-December, 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Beaver, and the Eleanor, arrived in Boston Harbor. The Sons of Liberty, led by patriot Samuel Adams, held meetings and tried to convince the governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, to refuse to allow the tea to be unloaded. Tension over the issue mounted in the city. On December 16th, the Sons of Liberty were told that the governor would not support their efforts to send the ships back to England. The Sons of Liberty decided to take matters into their own hands. After midnight, a group boarded the ships disguised as Mohawk Indians and destroyed the entire shipment of tea. 342 crates of tea were thrown into Boston Harbor. This event became known as the Boston Tea Party. Let's review what we have learned so far about the Boston Tea Party. Question 1. Which imports were taxed under the Townshend Act of 1767? A. Glass. B. Lead. C. Paint. Or D. All of the above. The correct answer is D. Glass, lead, and paint were taxed under the Townshend Act. Question 2. Who led the Sons of Liberty? A. Paul Revere. B. Samuel Adams. C. George Washington. D. Thomas Hutchinson. If you answered B, you know that Samuel Adams led the Sons of Liberty. Question 3. How many crates of tea were thrown into Boston Harbor during the Boston Tea Party? A. 115. B. 342. C. 550. Or D. 1,000. The correct answer is B. 342 crates of tea were thrown into the Boston Harbor. Intolerable Acts and the First Continental Congress. The British government was furious about the Boston Tea Party and responded by enacting a set of laws to punish the Americans and limit their freedoms. The British hoped that the other colonies would isolate Boston and that this would prevent the colonists from unifying against British rule. These laws were officially called the Coercive Acts, but were nicknamed the Intolerable Acts by the colonists. The Intolerable Acts included a law that closed the port of Boston until all damages from the Boston Tea Party were paid. They also included a law that limited Democratic town meetings in Massachusetts, a law that allowed British officials charged with a major crime to be transferred from American courts to British courts, and the Quartering Act, a law that required Americans to provide food and housing to British soldiers. The punishment of Boston by Parliament did not go unnoticed by the other colonies. Instead of isolating Boston as Parliament had hoped, the Intolerable Acts did just the opposite. The colonies began to unite. The other colonists began to realize that if it could happen to Boston, it could happen to them too. Other colonies began to send goods to Boston while the port was closed. More people began to join resistance groups like the Sons of Liberty. As a direct result of the Intolerable Acts, 12 of the 13 colonies decided to send representatives to a meeting to discuss creating a unified resistance to the King and Parliament. This meeting was called the First Continental Congress. It took place in Philadelphia on September 5, 1774. The delegates to the Congress included future presidents George Washington and John Adams. The goal of the Congress was to organize the colony's response to the Intolerable Acts. The delegates wanted to come up with a plan of action, but they were divided on what the best plan would be. Some delegates wanted to make a more peaceful protest, while others wanted to take bolder steps, which some feared would lead to war. In the end, the delegates decided to write a Declaration of Rights. Among the rights included in the Declaration were life, liberty, property, and the right to create their own taxes within the colonies. The document also provided an outline of the reasons for the colony's rebellion against the king, including the Intolerable Acts and the idea of taxation without representation. It stressed that the colonies were still loyal to Britain, but they disagreed with Parliament's right to tax them. The final draft of the document was approved by the delegates on October 14, 1774, and was sent to King George. The Congress also passed the Articles of Association, which called on the colonies to stop importing British goods on December 1, 1774, if Parliament refused to repeal the Coercive Acts. Before disbanding the Congress on October 26, 1774, the delegates decided to reconvene, or meet again, in early May 1775, if the British government did not respond to their petition. The Continental Congress never got a response from Britain, and the stage was set for war. Ready to answer a few questions about the First Continental Congress? Question 1. The Coercive Acts were given what nickname by the colonists? A. Intolerable Acts. B. Horrid Acts. C. Tax Acts. D. Punishment Acts. If you answered A, you know that the colonists called the Coercive Acts the Intolerable Acts. Question 2. In what city was the First Continental Congress held? A. Hartford. B. Boston. C. Philadelphia. D. New York. If you answered C, you know that the First Continental Congress was held in Philadelphia. Question 3. Who was not a delegate to the First Continental Congress? A. George Washington. B. John Adams. C. Alexander Hamilton. D. A and B. The correct answer is C. Alexander Hamilton was not a delegate to the First Continental Congress. Thinking question. In what ways can citizens make their voices heard in today's United States government?